So we saw that most people thought that life was formed perfect and permanent, much like as described in the New Testament of the Bible. That's the view in the West, Europe, and so forth. But Lyell and Hutton come along and suggest that the Earth might actually be a lot older than people had realized. They thought it was 6,000 years old. Lyell and Hutton said it was millions of years old, which meant there was more time to work with when it came to life changing. They also noticed that life changes or goes away in the fossil record. So life seems to go extinct, which is not something that people like Linnaeus or Cuvier expected. They did not think that a god would create life and then let it die. That would be weird. Why would that happen? They did not expect to see extinction in the fossil record. So then Lamarck comes along around 1829, and he recognizes, once again, that life changes over time. This is the pattern of evolution. If you remember, we talked about pattern and process. He proposed an incorrect explanation to why things changed, an incorrect process. By incorrect, I mean it's not supported by experimental data that we have since conducted, right? It was a good try, though. We shouldn't make fun of Linnaeus. He did the best he could. This is how science works. We provide explanations, and then those explanations are tested, and they either stand up or they don't stand up to the evidence. His explanation of the process of evolution was this idea of use and disuse. Now remember, he didn't know anything about genetics, right? So he didn't know about genes and proteins and all of that. He just thought that if organisms used something like their arms or legs, then those traits would be passed on to the next generation. If an organism did not use those traits, then those traits would disappear over several generations. And he called this idea inheritance of acquired characteristics. So organisms acquire characteristics in their lifetime and they pass them on. I'll explain that more in a second. And he thought that organisms had a drive to become more and more complex. I think Darwin kind of thought that too, which is incorrect. Meaning, in the hierarchy of life, if you're down here, you're trying to climb that ladder to become more and more human or more godlike, as it were. Now, a typical way to explain Lamarckian evolution is with a giraffe. So according to Lamarck, giraffes have long necks because of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And what I mean by that is probably the first giraffe had a short neck because most animals have a short neck. Now, if a giraffe was stretching its neck to reach leaves on a tree, it's stretching its neck really hard. That means it would give birth to an offspring with a little bit longer neck because its neck stretched in its lifetime. It acquired a slightly longer neck, and then it'd have offspring with slightly longer necks because of that stretching, right? This would be kind of like you going to the hypercenter and working out and getting strong muscles, and therefore your offspring would have stronger muscles. This is this kind of idea. Remember, this is pre-Mendel. This is pre-genetics. In much the same way, we could say that if someone was pruning a bonsai tree, this is a pine tree that would be hundreds of feet tall, but it's been pruned its entire life, so it's short. So if Lamarck was right, we would expect that we could take a seed from this pine tree and plant it, and it would grow into another bonsai tree. But in fact, what happens is if we plant a seed from this pine tree and we don't trim it or anything, it will grow up into a full-size pine because traits that are acquired in one's lifetime are not passed on to the next generation. So you working out at the hypercenter does not mean that you will give birth to a strong baby. Now, next comes Darwin, and he's born around 1809, early 1800s. By the way, he's born the exact same day as Abraham Lincoln. Pretty cool fact there. So this is a good timeline. You can see Hutton proposes the idea of gradualism, which is part of the idea of uniformitarianism. Okay, I called it uniformitarianism. Your book talks about gradualism, which Lyell explains further later on. Okay. There are several other things that happen that help to inform Darwin's views. Matt Malthus publishes an essay about how human populations are going to crash and people are going to die if we don't create more food sources. Lamarck publishes his version of evolution the same year that Darwin is born. So remember, evolution, the idea of evolution is a lot older than Darwin. Cuvier publishes his studies of fossils. Lyell publishes about geology. And at the same time, Darwin goes on his trip on the HMS Beagle, carrying a copy, I think, of Lyell with him. So he's reading about uniformitarianism, that notion thought up by Hutton and Lyell. He's reading about it while he's traveling the world on the Beagle, looking at different life forms. Several years later, The Origin of Species is published. You can come back to this slide to see how all of this fits together. So Darwin is this guy who's rich. He comes from a rich family. He goes to college, kind of wants to be a doctor, but the sight of blood makes him sick, so he decides that's not for him. He also is studying to be a pastor for the church, but he's into biology in a big way. And he gets a chance to sail on a boat with the sea captain. The sea captain's looking for someone from the same class, you know, an aristocrat, to sail with him so he has someone to talk to. And Darwin loves biology, so this is kind of like Darwin's, what do I want to say, like an internship for Darwin. He's a college-age student, gets on a boat, and he gets to sail around the world. Notice he leaves England, gets to sail around, literally around the southern hemisphere, going to Australia, Africa, South America. And then up here, right at the equator, is the Galapagos Islands, which is a big pivotal moment for Charles Darwin. So he's comparing organisms and rock features and all kinds of things at these different sites, and he's collecting critters. And he notices that on the Galapagos Islands, there are different food sources on different islands. And there's different kinds of finches on those islands. And those finches are adapted. They have adaptations, remember that word? Adaptations that allow them to survive on those islands. Now it could be that some kind of creator put different finches on the different islands. But Darwin starts to think, well, that's weird. First of all, he knows the Earth is older than it used to be thought. He knows that critters go extinct. He knows that organisms can change. So he's looking at all of this information and he's trying to figure out how all this fits together. All this new knowledge comes together. He's standing on the shoulders of those that came before him. And Darwin has experience with birds because he used to breed pigeons, I think it was, or doves, one or the other. I think it was pigeons. And he knows that you can breed dogs and birds and things to have different traits. This idea of artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans breed for different traits. So let me just show you an example from the botanical world. Wild mustard has been used to breed kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, and kohlrabi. All of these plants are the same species. They are the same thing. But broccoli, we have bred for versions of wild mustard that have great big flower heads. For cabbage, we have great big leaves. For Brussels sprouts, they have great big buds. For kale, I'm not even sure. They have a lot of leaves as well, kind of like the cabbage, but in a different configuration, right? Great big stems for kohlrabi. So they're all the same plant, but humans can breed the traits they want over time. Just like with dogs, we can take a wolf and different wolves, and we can pick the smallest wolf pup from a pack and only let the small ones breed for many generations, and we can end up with a chihuahua. Or we can breed for traits that we want, and we can end up with a golden retriever, or whatever, a poodle. Humans can do this thing known as artificial selection, when we breed for the traits we want, and we can get different critters out of that. So Darwin says, okay, we see these different finches. Now, humans can selectively breed organisms. Could it be that nature somehow selects for organisms as well? Could nature select for useful traits the way that humans do? And Darwin says, well, maybe so. And he calls this idea natural selection. And a definition from your book is that natural selection is those traits that are useful in a particular environment become more common than those that are not useful. It's not that nature literally chooses them, But if you have the wrong beak shape and you're on an island with seeds, but you can't eat the seeds, you die. If you have a beak that works for those seeds, you eat and you have babies. Therefore, that trait gets passed on to the next generation. Now, a quick warning, natural selection cannot anticipate the future needs of an organism. Meaning, if the Galapagos Islands change, if the habitat changes or new species move in, that bird may no longer be adapted to that island. But he looks at artificial selection and then says, well, if humans can do it, maybe nature has a way of doing this as well. Those traits that are useful in the environment become more common in that environment, and that is called natural selection. And we'll pick up there in the next video.